The soldiers around the campfire celebrate the day's victory, but the Saint Lavanese sang in the air, though they were in firmly held territory, surrounded by the undefeated army. They knew one thing with absolute certainty: they would be washed. This time, scouting on the land would be useless, despite the field were on the land, and there has been for thousands of years before. They were above it. The numbers, strategies, and even their rations were all being documented under cover of night by a spy balloon. I'm Joe Cook, and this is True History. If you were anywhere in the screen in February 2023, this is probably what you saw. China's spy balloon, spy balloon, spy balloon, Chinese spy balloon. Where the unmanned high-altitude surveillance balloon owned by China passed through North American aerospace or Alaska. Our eyes and cameras were glued to the sky for several days until it was shut down on the coast of South Carolina. The Chinese government called the destruction of the balloon an excessive reaction, while the U.S. Secretary of State canceled a planned visit to China. So why were two superpowers with satellites and spy planes galore obsessed about the balloon? Well, despite their unthreatening appearance, spy balloons have been vital to surveillance spying technique throughout history. Our story starts with a sheep, a duck, and a rooster. Yeah, really. In 1783, French brother Joseph Michel and Jacques Etienne Montgolfier designed the first passenger balloon called Le Réveillon, but were too scared to try it out for themselves. So I guess there were a sheep, duck, rooster, and two chickens. After ascending to a height of almost 2,000 feet and traveling over 2 miles, these brave aeronauts were designed heroes of the air and became attractions in Louis XVI Zoo. Shortly after, Pierre-Etoile de Rosier became the first man ever to be carried aloft when he took the terrorist flight in Le Réveillon. 11 years later, the French army became the first on the record to use balloon in battle for reconnaissance during the Revolutionary Wars. But it was really simulating inventors who pushed the limits, which is precisely how an eccentric balloonist named Thaddeus Lowe found himself sitting in the office of President Abraham Lincoln. So how did the dark brown tie become the valuable government assets for the Union Army? So how did this dark brown tie become the valuable government assets for the Union Army? It all began in 1861, just after Confederate attacks on Fort Sumter. Lowe was experimenting with the limits of the balloon technologies, even proposing transatlantic balloon flight for commerce purposes. To put his balloon dream to the test, Lowe embarked on the impressive 9-hour flight from Cincinnati. Unfortunately, the wind had carried him all the way to Confederate territory. Oops. Needless to say, the people of South Carolina were not really welcoming to the strange flying apparatus. Not in 1861, not in 2023. The local accused him of being devil, and another argued that he should be executed on the spot. He managed to talk his way out of the situation and catch a train to Columbia, South Carolina, where he was once again detained and threatened with all manners of violence. The mayor of Columbia, David Boatwright, reluctantly vouched for Lowe as a harmless hobbyist and ensured his safe travel to the north. But if he had known just how useful Lowe's invention would be to the Union, he might have made a different decision. The United States was in the midst of the Civil War, and the federal government, aka the Union, needed a strategy to gain the advantage of growing Confederate army. When word got out about Lowe's flights, he was invited to Washington, D.C. in June of 1861. He pitched the balloon technology to President Abraham Lincoln himself. Most impressively, he communicated directly with the president from 500 feet above the ground. The first ever telegraph from an aerial station. Lowe messaged Lincoln. These points of observation command an area nearly 15 miles in diameter, and in acknowledging indebtedness to your encouragement for the opportunity of demonstrating the availability of the science of aeronautics in service of the country. As far as we can tell, Lincoln lent him on the rate, but by August, he was given the money to build the first balloon for his new command, the Union Army Balloon Corps. Unfortunately, This dazzling demonstrated the telegraph being transmitted from the sky, proved spotty on the battlefield, and was nearly fully implemented. So primarily options to communicate highly sensitive messages were yell, land, and my favorite, secret codes. Flag colors, movement, and location would give key information for the generals on the ground, planning the next move. In one instance, a balloon used white flag placed in different positions around the balloon to direct cannon fire on the target 3 miles away. Raising a flag high would mean to fire to the right of the landmark, in this case the church. Lowering it signified fire toward to the left, and whether if it was held still or wave gave even more detail to the cannon apparatus on the ground. As early as September 1861, Lowe theorized about using colored flares to communicate over long distances during nighttime observation. By 1863, flares were being used by infantry units at night to communicate their movement by spying balloons located at various headquarters. He wasn't the first to think of this though. Much smaller and manned balloons were used to signal during military operations in China during the Three Kingdoms era. The concept of balloon corps also wasn't the first time. In 1840, the U.S. War Department explored using balloons to locate Seminole campfire in the Everglades. About 6 years later, John Wise proposed their use in Mexican wars, but wasn't taken seriously. But it was taken seriously nearly 2 decades later. And even if the outcome of the Battle of Seven Pines, also known as the Battle of Fair Oaks, the Confederate troops used tree lines and hill cover to conceal their advance, a common and generally effective strategies. However, that day, their plan was foiled by the Union's eyes in the sky, who warned the commanders about the incoming attack. The Union's forces were technically defeated that day, but without this new method of gathering intelligence, they may not have lived to fight another day. The Confederate Army was well aware of advantage provided by the Union's Army as surveillance balloon, but unfortunately for the rebels, they had neither the infrastructure nor the material specifically sealed needed to build their own balloons, so they innovated. According to the Confederate officer, a genius arose for a caution and suggests that we send our the gather together over the silk dress in the Confederacy and make a balloon. While that story was more likely myth than the fact, designer Langdon Lewis did use patchwork silk fabrics for the build. The balloon, called the Gazelle, was successfully put together north through the forced labor of enslaved people and deployed in the Peninsula Campaign. However, the Gazelle and the vessel towing it down in the James River were both captured just a few days after being deployed, and the Confederacy never built another balloon. I guess you could call it a lost cause, even for the Union, who had more resources. This early spy balloon had a lot of issues. They were fragile. The deadest line often caught in the trees or building and broke, sending the aerials floating away toward enemy lines. They were bulky and difficult to transport. On land, observation balloons were usually transported with a large wagon train and its own crew, and with nowhere to take over, they were vulnerable to artillery fire. With all of the challenge, the balloon corps was disbanded after only 2 turbulent years. But even though it was short-lived, it laid the framework for decades of aerial surveillance afterward. In 1824, Carl Ferdinand von Zeppelin, an acquaintance of Thaddeus Lowe, conceptualized and drew plans for British airship, an aluminum-framed vessel covered with fabrics, and containing several cells filled with hydrogen. When the First World War broke out, the German military deployed Zeppelin for surveillance and defense. And one of the first strategic bombing raids was when Quadrant attacked the Belgian city of Liège in August 1914. The U.S. continued to use balloons, including non-British ones like blimps, to surveillance and submarine patrol in both world wars, and they worked. During World War II, U-boats hung over 500 ships and unescorted convoys along the eastern seaboard of the U.S. But only one ship was sunk in the convoy and had blimps present, who knew Snoopy could be so effective? In 1940, the U.S. Air Force revisited the idea of aerostats, designed the Tatas blimp called the Tatas Aerostat Radar System, or TARS, to detect low-flying aircraft during the Cold Wars. Similarly, aerostats were deployed during the Drug War of the 1980s, and even saw service Afghanistan and Iraq. Nowadays, the modern spy balloon is unmanned and often deployed at an altitude of about 18,000 feet. But just like the balloon core, they are often at the mercy of the wind. You'd think we have that part figured out by now. But apparently, it's still up in the air. As people living in the modern world, we're pretty much numb to surveillance, from traffic cams to satellite emergency, or an ad that pops up for something you just mentioned. We have been accepted, but there's just something about seeing the thing that's watching us that's make us uneasy, isn't there? We panicked about the spy balloon. It's almost like just a few days we were back in 1862. How do you feel about being spied on? Tell us in the comment.